So the pet food companies teach young vets about nutrition. What they teach them is that raw food is dangerous. Raw food is not something you should ever feed a dog. The only thing you should feed is complete and balanced, scientifically produced, processed, ultra-processed pet food. Young students, they buy it. Why wouldn't they? Parents see how well their animal becomes on real food and away from the carbs. And as you were saying, on a more carnivorous diet, they suddenly wake up. They will ask me in a consultation, is this what I should do for myself? And the answer is, of course it is. Food in itself is almost a complete and balanced diet, plus the microbiome that they also require. So we have to just look at what dogs have eaten over evolutionary time, translate that into things that we can do now.
Let me just get started by saying thank you for doing it. I presume are you down in Australia, or where are you located?
Absolutely, in Australia, on the eastern coast seaboard, just about 2 hours from Sydney.
Got it. That's why all my Australian crew is here. Usually we do this meeting at 9 a.m. Pacific time, but when we interview folks in that part of the world, we often do that. And normally he doesn't care about the interviews, but for some reason Maximus wanted to hear this one for some reason. He's joined me for this. Maximus is an 8-year-old Coton de Toulier, and he's been on an all meat
breed I don't know about.
Oh yeah, they're Coton de Toulier. That's a French breed, apparently hailed from Madagascar. So it's an interesting story. Apparently there were some theoretic, this is conjecture, but apparently, I don't know, 1600s, a boat crashed with some white dogs on it. I think they were Bichon Frises, and they swam ashore to Madagascar, mated with the local whatever dog, and it became the royal dog of Madagascar. And so he's about an 18-pound. He's a pretty big one. He's a pretty good sized one, but he's just all meat. He's an all meat dog. So he's been thriving, and I've got a 12-year-old golden that is also on that. But I guess that brings us to our topic. You are, I guess, by some accounts, the father of the raw food movement among dogs. I guess you created maybe what's called the BARF diet, the biologically appropriate raw food diet. Is that correct, what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I put the diet together, but it wasn't me that coined the acronym.
Okay.
It was a lady called Debbie Tripp in Canada. This was way back in the mid-90s, of course.
Yes, 30 years ago.
Debbie the internet had just got going, and Debbie noticed all these. They were like evangelistic Christians because they had just discovered raw from my book, Give Your Dog a Bone. And they were absolutely crazy over it and trying to recruit as many. So they've been very evangelistic in their efforts to recruit as many people as possible. Very vocal. There was a lot of criticism both ways. And she called them born-again raw feeders. Hence the acronym BARF.
It's not perhaps the most appealing acronym in the world, but it's catchy.
It absolutely suits dogs, because if you've ever been to a party and you've come home and you're not feeling real well and you spill the contents of that party on the pavement somewhere, the dogs race straight in. They're very enthusiastic for BARF because dogs know the value of pre-digested food or partially pre-digested food.
Yeah, interesting.
Full of stomach acid contents, et cetera, et cetera.
I don't know. I know my dogs, I don't know if you know what I'm an advocate of something called a carnivore diet, which is basically meat for humans. And we've seen all kinds of just incredible, amazing disease reversals and that sort of stuff. So it's been quite interesting. And there's an analogy with dogs. And some would say dogs co-evolve. I mean, we basically created the dog from the wolf and they coexisted with us. And so we maybe had a similar diet at some point. What got you to, and I don't know what the environment was in Australia in the 1990s, but in talking to vets today, it's very much, they very much push the kibble, the dog food. It's like in all the vet clinics, it's somehow become almost doctrine that this is what dogs need. Dogs need wheat and grain and corn and pea protein and fortified vitamins. What was it like back then, and why did you go to this raw thing?
In Australia in not the 1990s, but we need to go back a bit. My career started in the late 70s, early 80s. And at that time, the vast majority of people fed at least some part of the diet as raw food. So actual food. Mm-hmm. So it was table scraps and bones. At that time, we were only just beginning to see the advent or the beginning of processed pet food. So that we had a history in Australia of feeding dogs properly. As a result, when I went through vet school, our teachers told us, we don't see the disease problems they see in North America. They couldn't explain it. They didn't understand why. Then over the years, as we started to import processed pet food from North America and then developed our own processed pet food industry, I, as a veterinarian, observed an increase, a terrible increase, in the degenerative disease processes. And this included cancer. And this has been on the rise ever since. So this began very early on. And without going into the details right now, my own experiences, I actually tried, because the family insisted at one stage that we use processed dog food, because we'd only ever fed bones and table scraps, because they felt, because we're going to show some dogs, they want to go into showing dogs, we were breeding dogs at the time, that we ought to feed the very best. And what had I been taught at vet school? At vet school, even back then, because of the advent of processed pet foods, they were beginning to tell us that the best way to feed a dog was with processed pet food. And all we had to do was read the packet. Now, there was no AFCO at that stage, or the American Association of Feed Control Officials, which now has to be on every pack of dog food to say it's complete and balanced. But back then, it was simply, as long as the pack says it's complete and balanced, that's all you need to know about canine and feline nutrition. And so we tried that. And for 2 years, I watched, actually, I didn't even notice at first, but eventually I did, my pets go downhill in all sorts of minor ways. So suddenly they were actually infested with fleas more often. Whereas before we could take a fecal sample, look for worm eggs, nothing. Now we could find them. Smelly coats, awful looking coats, broken hair shafts, infected ears, smelly mouths, starting to develop tartar on the gums. All of this from processed pet food. I was studying acupuncture at the time, and I met a whole heap of what appeared to be health nuts, Reiki, herbs, homeopathy, all that stuff. And suddenly the light came on for me that what I had been doing, which was processed, which was feeding raw meaty bones and table scraps, this was in fact very close to what they had evolved to require. Again, making a long story short, I went back in, started to do some literature research, do clinical research, and this ended up with my book, Give Your Dog a Bone, which then, that came into being just as the internet was starting. And we had this other thing happen, and we saw the rise of this idea of BARF. Now, when I saw this lady, Debbie Tripp, who had had come up with the idea that these were born-again raw feeders who were starting to feed raw food, she actually tried it herself. She was a German Shepherd breeder, and she'd had problems with orthopedic diseases in young dogs, so hip and elbow dysplasia, that sort of thing, and other problems like bloat. Anyway, she tried the raw food diet, and suddenly the light came on for her. And she said, let's get away from born-again raw feeders. I'm going to call this the bones and raw food diet. So that started. At this point, I was introduced by my nurses to what was going on online. I hadn't looked at this. Had a look at it. I said, the absolute vitriol that was occurring between the two camps, the raw food versus the dry food, I said, I'm not going into that. But I said, I like the acronym. And I said, but let's make it more scientific. Let's go with biologically appropriate raw food. That's how BARF, the whole idea, came into being. And the next thing was I'd written Grow Your Pups with Bones, which was a book about raising young dogs on raw meaty bones, basically. A bit more to it than that, but that was the crux of the matter. Then I saw that people needed a little handbook, so I wrote the BARF diet. So that was my third book. So that's how it all began. And I was then invited to England to speak about this. And we did, I think it was Manchester, and four major towns we spoke in. But this was Catherine O'Driscoll. If anybody knows Catherine O'Driscoll in the dog world, this may not be on this particular radar, but she's since passed away with motor neuron disease. But she was a wonderful person who was worried about vaccination. So she was against all that. But following that, I was then invited to North America, and this began a series of lectures right across the country. We spent about 13 major seminars across major cities in the US, 2 and 3 day seminars talking about raw. And I would say to them at these seminars, what you need to do is get a group together to buy meat and bones and put together this diet. Americans being what they are, which are canny business people, they all began, they said, no, we're not going to start these groups. We're actually going to start businesses. And so the raw food movement as a group of businesses making raw food took off. And then since then, there's been people writing about it, and it's become quite enormous on the internet. And so that's how the whole thing got started.
I'm interested in the genesis of the whole concept of the hyper-processed food for dogs, and then the sort of acceptance by the veterinarian community. How did that happen? Was there some sort of financial incentives to do this, or was this just a natural evolution of science?
It's certainly not. It's evolution of very bad science, if I can put it that way. It actually stems. It all began around about the 1850s when a fellow called Jack Sprat noticed that the dogs that were eating the biscuits from the ships, they just loved those hard biscuits. And so he thought, I own a biscuit making business. So he began turning the scraps of his business into dog food by taking the scraps of his biscuits, which were basically based on wheat, and adding blood and bone meal. So the bone, of course, was for their bones, and the blood was a source of calcium. So it was almost like adding fertilizer to wheat products. Anyway, from there, it grew very slowly. It took off this was in England, then it went over to the States. By the 1930s, there was what they were doing, they were canning the horses that were no longer used for. So there was horse meat canned. There was this hardtack biscuits. Then came the Great Depression. And during the Great Depression, people had nothing to feed their dogs. So again, they turned to more and more to wheat and grains to feed their dogs. And then coming to the 1950s, we still didn't have this complete and balanced idea. But what we had were these hardtack biscuits. Anyway, at that stage, it was Colgate Palmolive. They had stopped making soap from animal fats. But they still had this mass of animal fats. They said, what are we going to do with it? They said, we've got the dentists in our hands, Colgate Palmolive, so let's make some dog food. So they started getting these biscuits and added fat to it. And they came to the veterinary profession and said, we are making a complete and balanced diet. And we want you to sell this to your people because this is better than anything they can do. Anyway, they sold it to the veterinary profession at that stage. Now, from that point forward, particularly in the States, the veterinary profession was now being taught their nutrition. And probably before that, they weren't taught much nutrition anyway. It was just a given. The dogs ate bones and meats and scraps, and cats ate mostly a meat diet. But now that was no longer a given, because they were beginning to say we must feed them this processed, scientifically produced food, because they would start to look at the food, decide what nutrients were in it, and so on and so forth. So they developed this complete and balanced diet. Now today, well, when I went through vet school, yes, that's what we were taught. Only feed this stuff because it's the best. Today, because of the rise of raw, and it's huge, they actually, okay, let's go step back a bit. Think of a young person raised in a family, probably mum fed the dogs and probably with kibble, goes to vet school. Everything they're taught is brilliant. Pathology, medicine, surgery, everything. They know it's good. Then they're taught nutrition. Who teaches it to them? They go to what they consider, the universities consider the best. Why do they consider them best? Because these people, the pet food companies, actually fund much of the, not only nutritional research, but everything the vet school does is fund. That money comes from the pet food companies. So the pet food companies teach young vets about nutrition, or young aspiring or embryonic vets. And what they teach them is that raw food is dangerous. Raw food is not something you should ever feed a dog. The only thing you should feed is complete and balanced, scientifically produced, processed, ultra-processed pet food. Young students, they buy it. Why wouldn't they? And then thus they become the workforce, the unpaid salespeople for the pet food companies for the rest of their professional lives. They have actually been indoctrinated, brainwashed, if you will, into believing that this is the only way to feed a companion animal. They forget biology, they forget evolution, they forget everything that is logical, and they take this spin, this disingenuous story that they're given. It's very sad, really. But there is a growing awareness within some young people within the profession and some older vets, as they actually see what's going on, they actually work it out for themselves. But it's very hard because we now have a veterinary profession which has what I call cookie cutter medicine, where vets and doctors aren't allowed to think for themselves. They have to follow the party line of whatever they've been taught at university. If they go outside that line, they're more likely to be sued, to undergo litigation, because they have not done what the party line says. Very sad situation. When I went through, we were allowed to think for ourselves. And in fact, there was a large cohort of vets that would write in to this magazine and say, this is what we did. What the founder of the magazine, he was a vet called Tom Hungerford. He said, I don't want the niceties of medicine. I want what you actually did that worked. And he called it the guts, the dung and the blood of veterinary medicine. And we would do that. But this doesn't happen anymore. Everything has to be peer reviewed. And that is very artificial, particularly when it comes to nutrition, because you can't do a double-blind study with nutrition. How can you do a double-blind study when you've got raw meaty bones where a dog might be eating chicken wings and necks versus kibble? We know exactly what they're being fed. Anyway, what we have now is a situation where there are actually, if you look at it, there are lifetime studies. And this is what I'm bringing to people, because we have lifetime studies of animals that have been fed raw meaty bones, or they've all been switched and they were sick and then moved across to raw food, and the dramatic changes in their health patterns are enormous. Now, one or two of those is anecdotal, but if you have thousands and thousands of this becomes epidemiological. And I think most people now are beginning to understand epidemiology with COVID and all that. So this is the situation today. We are an evolving situation. We have a very robust pet food company fighting against raw food because they can see that it is against everything they do, particularly with the high carbohydrate, which is basically sugar, and which drives cancer and every other degenerative disease. But that's the situation, and I'm certainly there fighting for this for our companion animals. And, of course, there is a hidden agenda in all this, because when pet parents see how well their animal becomes on real food and away from the carbs, and as you were saying, on a more carnivorous diet, they suddenly wake up, hey, and they will ask me in a consultation, is this what I should do for myself? And the answer is, of course it is.
Yeah. Interestingly, I've read some like self-selection studies, like they give dogs and they'll put out X amount of fat, X amount of protein, X amount of carbohydrates. And if you look at what a dog will self-select, they'll select almost no carbohydrates. They'll select a pretty decent amount of protein and some fat. And then I saw the fat content went down after they got their fill, and then they went a little bit higher protein. And when I see, like for me, as someone who eats a carnivorous diet, I don't eat any carbs, so my fat intake is relatively higher. Got a bigger brain than a dog does, and I see that dogs probably just don't need quite as much fat as a human does. They just don't have as enough brain power. Have you seen studies like that? Have you seen what if you give a dog, hey, what do you want to eat? You put on a plate of broccoli and a plate of corn and a meat. They're going to pick the meat every time, right?
All of these studies are generally carried out by pet food companies, and the only thing they're trying to determine is how much protein they actually have to give to be okay. The studies that I've done is just said, get them off this processed food, get them onto real food. Now, you mentioned fat and brains. Dogs, it depends what dogs are doing. If you're a dog that's racing on the Iditarod up in the northern wastelands of, I presume it's in Canada, I'm not sure, Alaska. Yeah, you need mountains of fat because of the energy you require. And dogs also benefit from the ketogenic diet if they've got cancer or any neurological problem, just like a human. And in fact, the ketogenic diet is absolutely suitable for any dog. So dogs are fat eaters, but as soon as you give them cooked fat, that can be a bad thing, because particularly if they've been on kibble all their life, they're already degenerating, particularly in the pancreas. The pancreas releases a lot of the enzymes in their active form rather than waiting till they get into the duodenum. And, of course, then we have pancreatitis. So dogs are fat eaters, there's no question about it, and they can do very well on a high-fat diet, particularly if they're active dogs.
You said that I saw recently somebody pointed out that the golden retriever life expectancy in 1970s, 16, 17 years of age. Now it's 10 to 12. Is that something you observe? Has dog life expectancy gone down in certain breeds or across the board? And do you think that's directly related to nutrition?
Of course it is. Yeah, absolutely. The last third of most dogs' life, and sometimes it's getting worse than that, is absolutely filled with degenerative disease because they're eating a sugar-based diet. They're not obligate carnivores, they're facultative carnivores or carnivorous omnivores, but they do not need all this grain and sugar. In fact, it's a poison to them. It's a poison to us, let's face it. So it causes absolute inflammation throughout the body, which drives every degenerative disease, most especially cancer. And cancer is dogs are the most cancer prone and die more readily from cancer than any other species, including humans, because they're fed these high sugar diets, which simply feeds cancer. Cancer lives on sugar. And every other arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, kidney failure, liver failure, all the autoimmune diseases, all the terrible allergies, dementia in dogs, it's all happening because of what we feed them, this what I call poison chalice. It might be called politically correct food because the vets recommend it, but it's actually a poison chalice. It's terrible. I talk against it at every point I can.
You know, and I had a dog back. I fed him kibble, and this is years ago, and he died of brain cancer. It was small. He was about maximum size, and I think he died at around 9 or 10. He had seizures, and I think he had brain cancer, which I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think brain cancer is very common in some of these dogs. Is that not the case?
Probably not as common as it is in young children. We do see brain cancer. I never saw a lot in my practice, but then again, most of my patients were feeding very sensibly. I don't hear a lot of that. We hear a lot of lymphomas in dogs. We see mammary cancers in female dogs, obviously. Tremendous amount of things like hemangiosarcomas, particularly of the spleen. Brain cancer, not so much. It may be starting to grow now. I wouldn't be surprised. Again, the ketogenic diet is such an important tool here in brain cancer. And one of the worst things, of course, you can do is irradiate the brain, but that's what's going on. Anyway, that's another battlefront that I have. My latest book is called Pointing the Bone at Cancer, which is an allusion to an Aboriginal, they were witch doctors or Kadaitcha men, whatever you want to call them, who would point a bone that had a psychological effect of actually killing the person because the killer was their own brain, not because they got cancer, but because they believed they were meant to die because this bone was pointed at them. Anyway, I have used the allusion to bone both as that process of just a gradual elimination of cancer. We're talking about pointing the bone at cancer, and also the bone being the allusion to raw food, and particularly the ketogenic diet. But we are seeing definitely dogs dying at younger and younger ages. When I was in the States, I would meet people who would tell me, I have been feeding raw. And this was, I think, one particular lady, she had Great Danes. She bred them. And her Great Danes would live to 17 or 18 years of age and then die without having any particular pathology. Now, clearly, these animals were reaching their true use-by date when the body just shuts down naturally. What we see today is that dogs are dying early from all these degenerative conditions. And coming back to your point about the golden retriever, that's both a genetic problem and a food problem because very early on, I'm not sure how long ago it was now, a few decades, there was a very important sire that everybody wanted their golden retrievers to be related to or have as the sire over their particular breed. So his genes were spread throughout the whole golden retriever population, and he was highly prone to cancer. So now golden retrievers of all the breeds are one of the most cancer-prone breeds on Earth today. So that's a combination of genetics and abysmal nutrition.
I've seen recently a shift to getting away from grain-based dog food to now pea protein dog food, which has its own set of complicated. I saw this issue with cardiomyopathy in dogs. Have you noticed or heard anything about that?
Oh, yeah. It's a lack of taurine, basically, cardiomyopathy. And I'm assuming that they're now going to start adding taurine into these pea-based protein diets. But if you go back and look at any culture in the past, if they were using legumes, they were also using grains, because that's the only way to get a balance of the amino acids. So you have an unbalanced amino acid profile if you're just using pea protein. And beyond that, there's just no taurine in plant-based foods, so you're going to get cardiomyopathy anyway. So you're jumping from the frying pan into the fire when you go from grain to peas. Again, there's a simple rule here. If this is not what the dog evolved to require, don't feed it. If it's not the way the dog evolved eating, don't do it that way. And for example, dogs didn't evolve eating every meal to be complete and balanced, nor did they have regular meal times. There was not a rabbit turned up at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, then 6 o'clock next morning, which they then ate. It didn't happen that way. But that's what we're doing now. We're feeding them regular meals, and we're feeding them supposedly complete and balanced. They're not complete and balanced, by the way, but they are according to our current understanding of nutrition, which is pretty abysmal anyway.
There's a movement for vegan pet food. I would imagine you're not in favor of that either, I would assume.
It's not what they evolved to require. Having said that, you can do it. And it was done in England. And it was done in England during the last Great War, in the Second World War. Absolutely, at that time, they couldn't get anything for their dogs. Dog breeders would go to the knackery, to the local abattoir. And what was left there was the ruminal contents from cattle and sheep that were being slaughtered. And that's what they fed their dogs. Now, this was gut contents, highly fermented, because there were bacteria and protozoa, living organisms in that food, producing amino acids, essential fatty acids, vitamins, the whole balanced diet that a dog required, plus the prebiotics, all that vegetation. Dogs absolutely thrived on that. Plus, they got the actual abdominal wall, which was not fed to humans either. And the abdominal wall was also full of high in omega-3 essential fatty acids, high in protein. And in the vegetation, there was enough calcium to support them. Because if you think about it, where does a cow get its calcium from? From that vegetation, of course. This was a complete and balanced diet. But if you want to feed that, you've got to buck against the local authorities that will say that's illegal. And it's rather unpleasant because it stinks to high heaven.
The dogs still eat it up, though, sometimes. So it's interesting.
The dogs absolutely love stuff that stinks. Dogs are coprophagic. They love poo. In fact, if you've ever owned a poodle and a cat in the same house and you have a litter box, as I have, and in fact any dog, but we had poodles at the time, that litter box contains camembert cheese. It's of the highest order. Blue vein cheese. It's called cat poo.
Appetizing.
I love it.
Let's take a shift over to, I assume you've seen cats in your practice, and I assume the same sort of things. There's yes. Something called the Pottinger's cats, where they looked at cats that were fed not raw food, and after I think 4 or 5 generations, they lost the ability to reproduce. What was going on with that?
Mainly taurine. Again, mainly taurine. Taurine is destroyed by cooking, not present in plant foods, and none of the food was raw. But there were many other factors. There was an abysmally awful diet. And we actually, as veterinarians, as human beings, during the 60s, 70s, 80s, as we produced cat food, which was, according to their manufacturers, complete and balanced, we saw cardiomyopathy, we saw reproductive problems, very similar to Pottinger's cats, and we saw blindness. All of these factors, until it was realized that what they were feeding, this plant-based kibble, lacked taurine. And that was the obvious fix. And now people are so obsessed with taurine, they think even if they've got a meat-based diet, they've got to add taurine to it, which they don't. Well, if they cook it, they do, but that's a whole issue. So you I'm going to say so much ignorance out there. My whole thrust is that this is very simple. If you feed food which is of the same balance and type that an animal evolved to require, then you're going to get every nutrient that we know about, the ones we don't know about, and the ones that we don't yet see as essential. They all come in, and that's it. It is so simple. And everybody wants to make feeding their dog and cat exceedingly difficult, even when they feed raw these days. They want to have spreadsheets and computers, and they think that every meal has to be complete and balanced. And I have to point out to them, is that what you do for yourself, and B, is it what animals have done over the evolutionary time? And of course it's not. It's absolute rubbish. Animals evolved actually, and I believe that they will live longer if every meal is not complete and balanced. As long as the overall program has everything, that every food that they require, then they'll be absolutely fine. And the other thing is, people should understand that dogs are different to cats. Cats are obligate carnivores. At least 70 to 80% of their diet must be other animals. Dogs, being facultative carnivores, plus scavengers, which cats aren't, they require a much higher level of bones. And that other thing that we spoke about, they actually, as scavengers, they will eat and require to eat food that is fermented, actually going rotten, bacteria fills. And these are all things that we have to take into account. The poo element that owners should feed, what's in poo that dogs require? Well, if it's from herbivores, it's got a lot of fibre. It's also got, because it's bacterial bodies, it's high in all the essential amino acids, all the essential fatty acids, all the vitamins that the dog needs. Poo in itself is almost a complete and balanced diet, plus the microbiome that they also require. So we have to just look at what dogs have eaten over evolutionary time, translate that into things that we can do now. So add in some essential fatty acids, add in some probiotics. Maybe a good source is dairy probiotics. And people say dogs don't eat dairy. Of course they eat dairy. How do they eat dairy? Dogs over millions of years have brought down young animals. What was in the young animal's stomach? Of course, there was partly digested milk that they had consumed from their mum. But yogurt is close to that. Or if it's been treated with the rennet from what we used to call in Australia, and mothers used to feed it to their young children, junket. It was milk treated with rennet. The more we can try and copy what evolution teaches us, and this is good science, by the way, very good science. It's very simple science, but it's complex if you analyze how it works, simple in its application. Simply feed what evolution shows us they should be eating, and hey presto, you have a very healthy dog. And you don't need all that science, which is generally a pet food company looking at a grain-based diet and saying, how can I improve this so that I can put an advert out to say this is now new and improved.
You mentioned, so what is the purpose of the bones? Obviously there's calcium in there. Is there something beyond the calcium? It's calcium phosphate. What are they getting in the bones that they need?
Let's make first a simple observation. First simple observation is dogs will fight over bones. You have to ask why. We know they're scavengers. So they've evolved to eat lots of bones. Does that mean they actually need them? And of course, the answer has to be yes. Then you ask the question, why? We don't know all the answers to this, but it does give them their calcium and phosphorus in a form that overrides all other considerations so that they get the perfect form of calcium and phosphorus that will form their own bones. And you know that a dog is getting enough calcium phosphorus when the poo in the backyard turns white in the sun, because the body only takes what it requires out of real food. It won't take too much out of real food as long as the bones were raw. It's because it's a thing called, or it's a chemical called hydroxyapatite in raw whole bones. What else about bones? Of course, it contains raw meaty bones contains the whole range of essential amino acids. The marrow contains blood-forming elements. There is all that connective tissue, which actually acts like fiber in the gut, so it supports the healthy microbiome of the dog. So we do have proper calcium, phosphorus. We have all the amino acids. It's also full of fat, so fat-soluble vitamins. It's also got the essential fatty acids, particularly if it's taken from a long bone and it's a marrow. And one very important thing, the cartilage in bone. We know that cartilage of itself does at least two things, probably does more. One thing it does is to support healthy joints within the dog that eats that cartilage. The second thing it does, it has this property called it's anti-angiogenic. What does that mean? Angiogenesis is the formation within tumours, or just it's the formation of blood vessels. But one thing about cancer is that it cannot grow if it doesn't form blood vessels. And cartilage is anti-angiogenic, so it stops the formation of blood vessels within cancer. Dogs that eat raw meaty bones rich in cartilage all their life rarely develop cancer. Now, there's so much going on with that raw meaty bone. I'm sure there are other things that I haven't mentioned, I don't even know about. Because when I actually wrote Give Your Dog a Bone, all I did was make an observation. Bone-fed dogs, if they did nothing else, were the healthiest. I said there had to be good reasons for this. I could see some of them. I didn't know about angiogenesis at that time. It wasn't a word on my radar. But so, yes, people who think that bones are just a calcium substitute are dead wrong. And beyond that, of course, they're psychologically satisfying to a dog, to eat a bone. So it's good for their psyche. It's good for because they make hard poos, it's good for their anal sac. So it's anal sac emptying. They absorb toxins within the bowel. It's just such an important thing for a dog to eat bones. That's why I wrote the book.
Does it provide a benefit to their teeth as well? Is there a dental benefit?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yes, all of that as well. It provides that benefit as well. It just goes on and on. And if you provide the calcium in that form rather than in the soluble calcium in processed pet foods, it actually works against the formation of tartar because it encourages the right biofilm on the dental or on the teeth of the dog. You could, and I do, I even tend to myself to forget about all the benefits, some of them which you just mentioned, because I need a PowerPoint presentation now to remind me of what I got to say.
The other, and as someone who I eat a lot of meat and I have a lot of bones in the house, but they're often cooked. But you should not give the dog a cooked bone. Is that correct?
Correct.
Why is that?
And there's lots of reasons for that. The simple reason is over evolutionary time, dogs didn't eat cooked bones, but they do tend to set like concrete in the bowel. They become hard, and they can, if they get spiky, they'll pierce the intestines. And they're the only bones I've ever operated on to get out of a dog. I should make a caveat to that. In older dogs, if they eat too many bones, they will get an impacted bowel because particularly if they've been on kibble all their life and their bowel is now not functioning, their large bowel really well, and they can't expel the feces. And we have to use a thing called a fecal macerator, which is a long piece of metal which is attached to a hose, and it goes up the rectum, breaks up the fecal mass with the power of water penetrating it. And if you're using that, you have to stand to one side because the feces shoots out like a rocket, and it's rather unpleasant. But that's the old fecal macerator.
Sounds interesting. Like a water pick in the colon.
That's it, yes.
Speaking of the degenerative diseases that you've seen, and I've seen this just amazing transformations in human beings, and I'm sure you've seen similar things with dogs. What kind of maybe interesting things have you seen being reversed in dogs that have gone from, say, a grain-based kibble diet to a purely appropriate diet?
Just about everything. Increase in stamina, increase in longevity. The hair coat returns, looks beautiful. Teeth cleaned. Poos become normal. The arthritis starts to disappear, which is part of the activity that we see, this increased stamina. Increased stamina that's one of the most amazing things. I used to work with, he was an interesting fellow. He had a heart problem. He was retired. He was living off welfare. And where we lived in a place called Lithgow, which was west of Sydney, there was a lot of bush. We call it bush. I'm not sure what you'd call it, forest maybe. But in these forests or bush, there were wild pigs. And his great sport was to have big dogs and smaller dogs, and he would go pig hunting. Now, there were big dogs called luggers, which would grab on the ears. There were dogs that were finders, and there were other little dogs that would just yap around them to keep them occupied while the big dogs moved in. And anyway, he had all of these dogs, and he would report that when he was feeding kibble, after 2 hours of steady hunting, they would have to get back on the truck. Once we started feeding, and what he was feeding was just chicken carcasses, he would go down to a local chicken deboning place where they're getting the chicken ready for humans, and there were all these carcasses. He would just bring these back, throw them to his dogs. And, of course, they had little bits of organ meat in them. There were bones and cartilage and, of course, protein and fat. Almost pretty well a complete and balanced food just in these chicken carcasses. These dogs now could run all day. They didn't have to get on the truck after 2 hours. They were just absolutely an energy machine. And this was a simple change from feeding kibble to this food. So that was one of the earliest things I saw, this enormous increase in energy. But we see cancer disappear. And this is important. Or if it doesn't disappear, it's held as a chronic disease. The older dogs that have been on raw food all their life rarely develop cancer. If they do, it's very late in life. And if they do develop it, it's far less aggressive. And again, they usually die with it rather than from it. But every degenerative disease, whether it's pancreatitis, we see that disappear. Immune problems clear up. Allergies clear up. Just any degenerative disease you care to name doesn't happen or will start to disappear or become much more easily managed. Epilepsy, all the seizures, they disappear. They're very easily controlled, particularly with a ketogenic diet. And anything you care to name is usually the result of inappropriate food. If it's not, obviously there are genetic tendencies towards things, but even dogs with genetic tendencies on real food show the least damage from those genetic tendencies. They are a perfect illustration to us of how we ought to eat. We should be eating how we evolved. And that's very much a meat-based diet.
I've seen dogs they get a lot of graying in their face, their coat changes. I've seen that actually return when they go on raw diets. Have you seen that as well?
What have you seen return?
The color. They go from gray to black or whatever they used to be. Yeah, that's interesting that their hair color would change.
Sorry, I missed that. Yeah, most definitely. Again, what we're seeing is a normalizing of the body. I tell people, look, it's a bit like this. If you have a car, do you put in the wrong fuel, the wrong spare parts, the wrong lubricant, stuff that the manufacturer didn't recommend? Manufacture of our dogs is evolution. And so we simply have to do what the manufacturer recommends, and suddenly everything normalizes. Normal is called health. The problem is our veterinarians don't even understand that health is normal. They think disease is normal, and they expect to see it. And they expect to see this disease at a certain age. Mind you, a lot of diseases are now turning up at younger and younger ages simply because of this terrible food. The whole thing is very simple. Get them off kibble, feed them real food based on evolutionary principles.
Let me just get a couple opinions on maybe different, like we have pets that are neutered and spayed. Is that something that good, bad for them? I'm just wondering if do you have an input? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Again, I think kibble-fed pets that are spayed or neutered or early may have more hormonal problems than a dog fed with real food. Over time, I haven't seen a great many problems. Very occasionally, I have seen a dog that had a beautiful temperament. Almost immediately after it was neutered, the temperament changed, but not very often, just occasionally, very occasionally. But yes, they will get fatter after they've been neutered. And again, you have to watch their diet very carefully then, because they've got less interest, obviously, in sexual activities. All they want to do is eat. And if they're eating carbs, then they're getting these fluctuations in blood sugar and fluctuations in insulin, all of which is going to lead to hypoglycemia, the requirement for more food. And if they're fed more carbs, it just leads to this vicious cycle of rising insulin. And insulin, of course, promotes inflammation and, of course, obesity, because it's the hormone of storage. Again, all you got to do after you've had your dog neutered and you should have done it beforehand anyway, is feed them real food based on evolutionary principles, what they have evolved to require. It's beyond simple.
What are your thoughts on my dogs? I generally feed once a day. Sometimes I skip a day. They'll just fast for a day sometimes, and they're fine with that. It doesn't seem they come around and then they realize they're not getting any food and they're fine, and then they get the next day and they're quite happy. But I also sometimes there's like little pig ears and bull pizzle and stuff. Is that stuff okay as well? Those little odds and end bits and pieces, or they're not okay?
Okay, think about evolution. I mentioned earlier, the rabbit doesn't turn up on time at 4 and 6 or whatever schedule you've got or people have for feeding their dogs. Also, so that's number one. Irregularity is good. Regular fed dogs often develop real problems because of it. If the food doesn't turn up at that time, their body has become so used to it, they start producing acid, and then they start becoming nauseous from that. So irregular feeding is good. I've had dogs, once they've switched to raw, only asked to be fed, sometimes once a day, sometimes every second day. And there was one lady whose dogs, they were Hungarian vistas. They only wanted to be fed every third day on real food. Now, this takes us back to what happens in the wild. Again, evolution. Dogs in their native state, and I'm talking about even feral dogs and maybe dingoes, did not eat every day. They ate at irregular times. And if they had a large animal, they would feast on it and then rest maybe for 2 or 3 days before they ate again. Also, they would hunt little things. They'd find a mouse here or a cricket. And at times, of course, if in Australia we have plagues of insects, that might be all they eat for months at a time. But the point being, yes, feeding those little bits of treats and odd bits of food at odd times, absolutely fine. It's the way they have evolved to eat at odd times, to eat small meals, to eat big meals.
Yeah, and this is a funny humorous story. I interviewed a gal, her name is Molly Schuyler. She's a competitive eater and female, pretty small, about 120 pounds. What is it? 55 kilos or something like that. And so I'd read that like a gray wolf can consume 22 pounds of meat in one setting. They'll gorge, they'll wolf it down, so to speak. They'll gorge. And she actually went in and ate 22 pounds of prime rib in one setting, which I thought was incredible and amazing that a female could do. Anybody could do that, but particularly a small female. But what about letting a dog gorge themselves like this? Is it because in the wild, if they came across an animal, they would eat and eat and eat and eat. Is there any utility in that?
I don't think we have to probably go to those extremes. I've never actually seen anybody do that, so I can't really comment on whether in today's dog that's a good idea or not. But I think it just illustrates the fact that, yes, they can have a big meal and then not eat for a day or two. That's absolutely fine. And there are some breeds that are more likely to do that than others. And again, it harks back to their recent evolutionary history. And I'm thinking now of a Labrador Retriever. Every Labrador that I have known is an absolute gorger of food and will keep eating till it absolutely bursts. And this probably relates back to the fact that where they were raised, I think it was probably in a place called Labrador or Newfoundland or somewhere, where their job was to swim out and drag boats back in. And that was a very strenuous task. They had to eat large amounts of food to get the energy they required. And so these dogs that could do that were selectively bred for this ability. As to your question, it's obviously not going to. Some dogs, it may harm them. Let me think about some breeds that it may. Deep-chested dogs, eating a lot of food, particularly if they gulp down a lot of air at the same time. And I'm thinking now of a specific case. It was, in fact, a Great Dane, and the owner was at a dog show, and he had a bucket full of chicken wings. It was a big dog, and he literally threw them like a frisbee to his dog, who would catch them, and gulp down some air and a chicken wing. And he did this for about 2 hours until the dog was absolutely, literally bloated. And it did bloat, had a stomach torsion, and died. And then that became a recipe not to feed chicken wings, but it was actually a reason not to do what he did, which was to feed a mass of food under those circumstances where it flew through the air. And if you think about it, chicken wings flying through the air is not an evolutionary situation. You have to obviously temper common sense with this predilection that most dogs have to gulp their food. Our dog, for example, Little Honey, she's a cockalier, a Cavalier King Charles crossed with a Cocker Spaniel, darling little thing, very active, an active lap dog, if you can picture that. But you give her food, boom, straight down. And my wife says, why don't you taste it and enjoy it? But she doesn't. She just gulps it down. If it's a piece of vegetable, she says, no, you can put that somewhere else. I don't want it. She knows what she likes, but it's just gulped down. So dogs are gulpers in the main. And that's why with something like a bone, it's very important to have it big enough that they can't gulp it down, because some dogs have been known to gulp down just the right size and block a trachea, or trachea as it's called in America. But so it has to be something that they can work on and spend a bit of time actually ripping and tearing the meat and cartilage, etc., off the bone.
The veterinarians that don't agree with feeding your dog a biologically appropriate diet, that think that all of our dogs should be eating engineered kibble food, what is their argument against the type of diet that you would recommend? What do they say is wrong with that?
They've been taught three things: bugs, bones, and balance. They believe that a raw food diet is all meat and therefore it's unbalanced. They don't know about bones, but if they do know about bones, they are concerned that the bones will cause problems. And of course, the other thing is bugs. They want every bit of food to be sterile because they still can't grasp the idea of the microbiome. I've seen what these vets, because this is what they've been taught, okay? I mentioned earlier that all their other teaching is good, but their nutritional teaching is skewed terribly towards processed pet food. So they believe passionately that bones will kill dogs. In fact, I've seen vets take an x-ray of a dog who's just eaten a bone meal, seen the bones in the stomach, and assumed that this was a problem, and have actually then gone ahead, operated on the dog and pulled the bones out. A lot of money, scare the hell out of the owner, damage the dog in terms of every operation does some damage, and all totally useless. The other thing they will do, sadly, is they will tell porkies. They will tell the owner that they do 6 or 8 operations a week removing bones from dogs, even if they don't, but enough to scare the owners. And this is done in good faith because they passionately believe bones are bad. They just tell these porkies so that the owner will be scared enough not to feed bones and will feed what they think is the best diet, which is processed pet food. So this is training, and this is brainwashing, and this is where our profession is.
And when they're talking about, I spent all this time when you are doing exploratory laparotomies, pulling bones out of dogs' intestines, do you think it's all cooked bones then, or do you think they're making it up, or where do you think that's coming from?
What they're seeing is raw bones. I'm talking about these particular occasions. They've seen raw bones just being quietly worked upon by the stomach acid and assumed that they were a problem. Now, cooked bones, definitely, they're likely to be a problem. Don't feed cooked bones. It's not what dogs evolved to eat. And that's it's easy. Don't do it.
So Maximus here, he just turned 8 like yesterday or 2 days ago. So he's 8 years old. He's been to the vet like once. I just don't go. Am I doing bad by him? I'm feeding him basically a all appropriate diet. He doesn't go to the vet. Is he missing out? Is there something I'm harming him by not bringing him to the vet every year or whatever?
My dogs don't go to the vet either.
Okay. There you go.
I've very rarely had to put my veterinary hat on to treat my own dogs. I hate doing that. And it doesn't happen. In fact, the other day, I'll relate a story. We put a bird feeder in the backyard, which we hadn't done for a long time. There's been a bird count going on in our area, and so we started to do that. And our cat, who's off the farm, and we're now living in suburbia for 3 years, sadly. Anyway, for the first time in 3 years, we're seeing birds in the backyard in large numbers. And she literally started to vomit. Literally, just observing this, it was so much. The mental tension for her. Anyway, my wife was very worried, so I had to put my veterinary hat on. So we examined her, temperature normal, everything was normal. And I said, the only other thing, maybe she's got an impacted large bowel. Felt the large bowel with my veterinary palpating hands, and nothing in there. She was absolutely empty. So we locked her away from the birds for 24 hours so she could forget about them or try to forget about them, fed her small meals, and she came back to normal. This was totally psychological. But that was an example of me having to put my veterinary hat on. But I make the food completely for my own animals. We use a grinder and chicken wings and all the rest of it ground up. And so we make beef patties for one meal and chicken wings and necks and other raw meaty bones at other meals. That's what they have. They never get sick. They don't require my attention. And that's the way I like it.
Yeah, makes sense. And let me just ask you, for the people that may still be skeptical about bones, what about grinding the bones up and feeding them that way? Is that
what I said to people? If you are really worried, or you have an old dog with no teeth, now they can't crunch up bones. Grinding bones is absolutely fine. And that's where the beef patties came into being, that you can grind them up. So you can actually put everything you want to put into a beef patty with the ground up bones. And so I've got a commercial grinder. It'll do 250 grams of meat and or bones like chicken wings, necks and so on an hour. So we make all our own food. We make the beef patties and then we just feed them other raw meaty bones. So one meal of raw meaty bones, one meal of these patties of whatever I happen to have been was available at the local supermarket at the time, whether it's chicken gizzards or whether it's a lamb hearts or beef liver, whatever it is that we put it in. And so they get their varied diet over time. They do absolutely fine. And if you look at the poo in the backyard, it's all different colours. If there's been a bit of extra vegetable they've eaten, then it's brown. If there's lots of bone in that piece, then it's white. And if they've had too much meat, it'll be sloppy because that's what happens, or too much liver. But that's normal. It's physiological. It's not pathological. But you can tell from the poo what they've been eating. But so long as it's real food and within the scope of what they evolved to require, you are doing absolutely fine by your dog. And you're also, if you're feeding real food, you're feeding the microbiome within that dog. And the microbiome is responsible for digestion, for mental health, for immune stimulation, for anti-aging factors. This microbiome, bacteria, and it's all present native in real food, so long as you haven't sterilized it by cooking or some other means. And that's one of the problems with a lot of commercial raw food. We've had to put it through some form of process to sterilize it, usually high pressure sterilization, which is sad.
Dr. Billinghurst, thank you so much for doing this. Time is running out on this one, but let me ask you just if you can share like where people can go to get more information about your stuff, maybe your books or websites or something like that. They might find out more information.
Yeah, just go to drianbillinghurst.com. It's just .com. I'm also involved with a microbiome company through which we're now producing, if you can see that, my ultimate pet food course. And if they want to go to Gussie's Gut, they can have access to putting their name down if they want to take part in my pet food course. We're doing this because people have made feeding pets so complicated. I'm bringing back the simplicity and teaching people how to do it very simply. All the stuff we've been talking about today to a large degree.
And is that exclusive to Australia, or do you have stuff in like the US?
No, that's Gussie's Gut is actually in America.
Okay.
They're making a fermented vegetable mix. It's brilliant. But in this case, yeah, they can get that as well. But I'm suggesting that if they want to learn more about raw feeding from the horse's mouth, so to speak, they go to gussiesgut.com and they can register and put their name down to become part of this program.
All right. Maximus has enjoyed this lecture as have I, and I appreciate it. Thank you so much. And for the rest of the folks, thanks, everybody. Take care. Take care, Dr. Billinghurst. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.